Hello everyone, I am Adrita Das and I welcome you to the panel discussion on the NEP and RTE. Last month, the government, through a media announcement, introduced the new Education Policy 2020, which overhauls the National Education Policy of 1986. From school to higher education, this policy proposes sweeping changes which will have a lasting impact on the education system. While the government has described the NEP as a watershed movement, its critics are wary about the implications. It has been criticized for excessive centralization, unrealistic goals, attempts to undermine the RTE, and focus on e-learning and vocational education, amongst other things. But most importantly, this policy is another one in the list of several critical policy decisions that the NDA government has introduced without any kind of legislative scrutiny during this lockdown. To discuss and understand the possible impact of the implementation and impact of the NEP, specifically in relation to the RTE, we are today privileged to host Professor Manoj Jha, Member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha, Mr. Amrish Rai, eminent activist and national convener, Right to Education Forum, and Dr. Vikas Gupta, Professor, Delhi University. Professor Gupta, let me begin by asking you, the NEP is a complex piece of document. While it talks about universalization of education and promoting quality inclusive education, it has also been criticized for undermining the RTE. You've been quite vocal about this issue. So could you please explain these contradictions to our viewers?
There are three parts of the response to your question. And the first one is rather fundamental. I would still prefer to call it draft national education policy rather than national education policy. Maybe later on I can elaborate it. Okay. Now, the second thing is that insofar as the question of the universalization of elementary education is concerned, it is never possible until the masses of this country are left to receive substandard education. Right? Now, what you see in this draft policy is there is a provision for school complexes, which was originally proposed by the Kothari Commission in a very different context as part of the common school system. They have not borrowed that idea. They have only taken the school complexes idea, and they have themselves, the government itself has noted that there are about 28% schools which have 30 or lesser number of students. Fine. By and large, there are half of the schools, even more than that, which are, in terms of intake of students as well as infrastructure, very poor. Now, the RTE Act had certain norms and standards as mentioned in its schedule. How satisfactory those norms and standards are is a different question. Now, when you adopt this idea of the school complexes, the schools are then actually freed to adopt as something mandatory any standard norms and facilities. That's one. Second, these are the schools which are largely attended by disadvantaged sections. If that is so, then we are keeping them always to receive substandard education. And if there is something which is substandard, then, it is not really that aspires people, for which people really aspires. Third, this policy proposes school examinations to begin, not school examinations, rather examinations by the competent authorities from class 3 itself, whilst the RTE Act, in order to retain students for longer in the school, had eliminated the conventional examination up to 8th standard and substituted it with a different form of regular assessment. Fourth, the RTE Act had, like this policy, actually failed to enshrine pre-primary education as a fundamental right. Now, this policy, in a very clever manner, further complicates it, because what it does is that it merges the pre-primary education of 3 years with the first 2 years of school education, and thus makes the first 5 years of the new structure, at the end of which is an examination in class 3. So another this thing for elimination, structure for elimination. A point to be noted in the policy in this regard is that the policy clearly says that this new structure is only pedagogic and curricular. It does not require any physical change. What does it mean? It means that the pre-primary education centers will remain at best part of the school complexes. They will not be part of the schools as such. What we see, for example, in the private schools today is that you have, the pre-primary education, while in government schools you don't have it. So at the entry point itself, the parents are encouraged to admit their children in the private schools and discouraged to admit in government schools. Now, this policy cleverly pushes them to do it more, So it is basically another, and then it changes the definition, of the EWS and makes it what it calls the SEDGS, that is socially and economically disadvantaged groups, and which is something unconstitutional, and I can elaborate it later. But one example is that one way, for example, to include women would be to say that, this is like SC, ST, OBC, religious minority. By the way, it does not use the term religious minority. It only uses the term minority, which could mean anything. Now, it does not say that and women and girls belonging to each of these sections. Rather, it includes women in it alongside with economically deprived people. So, when we've gone considerably away from the definition of the disadvantaged as enshrined in the Indian Constitution as well as in the RTE Act. So basically, it's a very clever move to actually do away the existing social justice provisions, and to kind of broaden them to the extent that they include everything without any distinction, without any specific social target. So there is no way, this is the last point in this regard I would like to make, that, when you're going to create a structure, if you look at section 3, which is on dropout, section 6 and section 14, which are on the inclusive education, what you find is that for these people, the policy makes provisions which are only instrumentalists, which provide them substandard education to these masses, and which do not address the larger sociological and epistemological issues. So without addressing those issues, like the earlier policies, this one is not only status quoist, it is going to aggravate the problem much more, because in various ways, and which we can discuss in subsequent questions, the state is not just withdrawing from crucial aspects, it is also taking away the rights of the states and the local authorities. So that we can discuss in the subsequent ways. But I'm saying that it actually violates and undoes many of the provisions of the Indian constitutions with regard to elementary education, particularly the promise of free education. And it also, in a way, dilutes many provisions of the Right to Education Act. It even takes away the right from the apex body of the elementary education in each state. What is the apex body? The School Education Department. It cleverly takes away the right of this apex body in each state to monitor the implementation of norms and standards in the school. So how are we going to achieve it then?
Right. Thank you, sir. I think Amrish sir's internet has dropped. I wanted to ask him a question related to this, to the points that you were making, but I think I can come back to that later. Meanwhile, Professor Jha, the NEP also proposes a highly centralized model of functioning. This has been one of the criticisms. The National Education Commission, for instance, will be headed by the Prime Minister, with the Union Minister for Education as the Vice Chairperson and numerous other bureaucrats as members. And despite education being a concurrent subject, only select CMs are to be represented, and that too on a rotation basis. There's no mention of including state education ministers here. Does this not undermine the federal structure?
Thank you so very much. I tell you, this is the new form of cooperative federalism, what we are seeing in last couple of years. While the rhetoric is very powerful of cooperative federalism, in instances like this, you actually see the opposite. My worry with this highly centralization, my worries begin that I would join Vikasji. I would still consider it a draft, because such a sweeping changes which it contains, and not all changes are for the better. I believe legislative scrutiny was very, very important. I mean, I'm amazed that how can you bring a document which is, it's not like buying a piece of item for, say, hospital beds or oxygen or oximeters. You are actually shaping the contours of the future.
Right.
In such a scenario, I don't know what was the haste when pandemic has halted everything. I fail to understand why it couldn't wait for a parliamentary engagement or legislative scrutiny. Then probably it happened. Now, it also says that it has spoken to large number of stakeholders from Pradhan to Prime Minister. I'm sorry to say that when you start loving your voice, you prefer to listen to voices which say yes in your echo chamber. Now, that's my second argument. Third, as you rightly said, education being a concurrent subject. I think when you evolve this kind of mechanism, Prime Minister heading it, and on rotation basis, education cannot be subjected to the whims of rotation. It doesn't convey the seriousness which it requires. Now, I would join Vikasji and tell you, there was this long Kamraj versus Chakravarti Rajgopalachari debate. I think this debate is being settled for all the wrong reasons in all the wrong directions. Why I say this? Because this document, if implemented, it has no solution for the inequality we are already grappling with. It has no solution. In fact, it might be much more regressive than what we had seen in the previous policy frameworks. Number one. Number two, I have a huge problem with that exit option. That too at an early level, in the name of vocation and all that. You know, is it a kind of situation where we are going to make sure that there shall be perpetually two classes, one who shall have all the privileges and one who shall have no privileges but shall be expected to attend to the needs of those privileged ones. So that should worry everyone, cutting across political spectrum, cutting across whatever background we have. You know, then there is something called what is said special education zone. Special education zone also disturbs me as we were disturbed by the special economic zones. We know what happened to special economic zones. Finally, in the opening remark, I must say, Adwaita, that, privatization and commercialization, they have been legitimized. You know, I would just take 1 minute tell you that corona pandemic has at least busted a myth. The myth was that the 5-star hospitals which came in India in last 20-25 years, they are such a powerful entity that they'll take care. In pandemic, they succumbed, they failed. Whatever dilapidated in health infrastructure, public health infrastructure we had, that met the crisis. Now, I worry for it that tomorrow, again, the education right from the beginning shall divide people, shall write the destiny for students. One entering in a particular format and his destiny or her destiny could be foretold. Now, if an education policy results in such kind of a brazen inequality which does not disturb the rhythm of the ruling regime or the people who documented it. I think we need to look afresh at our priorities. I shall join you later again with the second thought. Amrish ji has come. Thank you, Aditya. Thank you for inviting me.
So, yes, Amrish ji, welcome
Yeah,
back.
my
Can you
net
hear
was
me now?
very disturbed, so I could
No,
not
that's
listen.
all right. We can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So Vikas sir had spoken about how the NEP actually seriously tries to dilute the RT. I would like to ask you a question along the same lines. The RT Forum has been very vocal about this. It has come out with a statement on the NEP where it has pointed out that the policy talks about universalization of school education, but does not make pre-primary and secondary education a fundamental right. Can you tell me about how this will affect the implementation?
No, actually, they ignored the fundamental right to education in the policy, and they didn't mention the name of right to education. You know, right to education is bigger than policy, because this is the law of land. Both houses of parliament has enacted this policy, and policy is this Right to Education Act. And first time right to in the history of independence, through the right to education, we could say that we could explain that what norms and standard should be for a school, for a good school. The first time RT Act had explained about the norms and standard in schools, and they ignored the whole Right to Education Act. And you will get surprised that the first draft, which was submitted by Kasturi Rangan committee to the Education Minister, there was mention of Right to Education Act. They categorically said that universalization would be through the Right to Education Act, and we need to bring the 3 to 18 years age group under the purview of the Right to Education Act. And they thrown out that in the policy. उन्होंने इसमें से बाहर उसको निकाल दिया. और आपको ये जान के बहुत हैरानी होगी कि जो पॉलिसी हमको चाहिए थी इसलिए कि वो कानून को मजबूत करे, फंडामेंटल राइट को मजबूत करे, कानून में जो कमजोरी है उसको दूर करे. कानून के जो 10 साल के एक्सपीरियंसेस है, you will be surprised that Right to Education has given 2 timelines, 2013 and 2015, and even enactment of the after the enactment of the 10 years, only 12.7%. This is the government data. 12.7% schools are RT compliant. What is the pathetic situation of implementation at the ground level this law? और आपको जान के हैरानी होगी कि if you bring हाथ धोना और पानी पीना और पीने का पानी और functional toilet together, so you will find only 52% schools in the country, and you are saying that you are growing economy. 8.3% schools are single teacher schools. That is more than 1 lakh.
True.
And you see the 9 lakh teacher vacancy at the elementary level. Teachers' posts are vacant, 9 lakhs. And how this pathetic condition of the implementation of a law, जो law इतने दिनों के बाद आया, उसमें कमजोरी क्या है अलग बात है, लेकिन लॉ ने पूरा बताया कि आपके स्कूल्स में कितना जो है पीटीआर होगा, कितना हर स्कूल में फंक्शनल टॉयलेट होगा फॉर सेपरेट फॉर गर्ल्स, all these things, but the law is not being implemented. Policy should have take a review of this implementation, लेकिन इस पॉलिसी में उसका कोई जिक्र नहीं है. और without mentioning of RT Act, they are saying that 3 to 18 they will universalize education from 3 to 18 years for the children from 3 to 18 years. How could you universalize education without a law? और law को आप law is a mandatory for union government as well as the state government, and you are ignoring the law. तो ये केवल कोरे वायदे के सिवा और कुछ नहीं है कि आप यूनिवर्सलाइज करेंगे. यू आर टॉकिंग सो मेनी थिंग्स इन द इंट्रोडक्शन पार्ट कि अगली सदी तक हम अगले 10 सालों में देश युवाओं का देश हो जाएगा. सो वी नीड टू revive our education policy. You are talking that you have to achieve the sustainable development goal till 2030. So for that purpose, you need to revise your education policy, restructure your education policy. But where education system? But where you are doing? When you come to the action part, so that is only promise. There is no concrete roadmap. There is no mandatory provisions in the education policy. So I agree with our friends that this policy is not mandatory. This is only a promise, draft of promises only. That nothing is there. And if you come to the resources आपको मालूम है कि 54 साल पहले कोठारी आयोग ने फर्स्ट एजुकेशन कमीशन ने 6% जीडीपी का शिक्षा पे खर्च करने की बात की थी. एंड दिस इज 54 years has been passed and we never reached up to the 6%. We are trailing behind 4% or 3 to 4%. At present we are investing only 3% on education. और पिछले जो कोठारी कस्तूरी रंगन ने जो ड्राफ्ट दिया था उसमें उन्होंने कहा था कि 10 साल में हम एक्सपेंडिचर को डबल करेंगे, 10% से 20% करेंगे. एंड दे हैव पुल्ड आउट, उन्होंने उसको बाहर कर दिया. और ओनली दे प्रॉमिस लाइक ऑलवेज दे आर डूइंग दैट कि 6% हम पूरा करेंगे. कैसे करेंगे? क्या इंक्रीमेंटल रोड मैप होगा? कैसे आप 6% तक पहुंचेंगे? विदाउट रिसोर्सेज we can't make our schools RT compliant. We can't provide teachers. We can't provide drinking water, sanitation, everything which is needed at the time of reopening of school after Corona crisis. So ये कैसे होगा बिना resources? You are not talking about that. और थर्ड चीज जो मैं कहना चाहता हूँ कि इसमें जो बहुत ही खतरनाक बात है वो ये है कि वोकेशनलाइजेशन की जो बात क्लास 6 से आपने शुरू कर दिया. So you want to push poor people out of the system, out of the education system, and you want to make all these children, poor family, marginalized children, a part of the cheap labor market. So you are pushing them out of this education system. इसीलिए और मैं आपको बोलता हूं कि ये एजुकेशन पॉलिसी ने इस क्राइसिस के पीरियड के भी जो इश्यूज हैं उनको एड्रेस नहीं कर पाया, क्योंकि अभी कहा जा रहा है कि 3.5 करोड़ बच्चे आउट ऑफ स्कूल हैं. एंड पीपल आर सेइंग इफ स्कूल विल बी क्लोज डाउन अप फॉर 6 months, that the 4 month has been passed, तो इट विल बी डबल. मतलब इसकी संख्या दोगुनी होगी. चाइल्ड लेबर बढ़ेगा, ट्रैफिकिंग बढ़ेगी, चाइल्ड मैरिजेज बढ़ेंगी और गर्ल्स विल बी इफेक्टेड, मोर इफेक्टेड इन दिस कंट्री. सो डिसकंटिन्यूएशन होगा उनका. इसके लिए इस पॉलिसी में कोई ऐसा सुझाव नहीं है, सोल्यूशन नहीं है कि वार फुट पे आप कैसे इन बच्चों को इनकी शिक्षा को कंटिन्यू करेंगे और इसके लिए बात करेंगे. व्हाट यू आर टॉकिंग, लास्ट पॉइंट, व्हाट यू आर टॉकिंग अबाउट ऑनलाइन एजुकेशन under the pressure of technology companies. We are for the technology, we are for the ICT, but it should not be a replacement. We have only 24% people access of internet and 10% only people having laptop and computer devices. तो इसका मतलब कि ये फिर एक बार दिस इज द फर्दर एक्सक्लूजन ऑफ मेजॉरिटी ऑफ स्कूल गोइंग चिल्ड्रन थ्रू दिस डिजिटल डिवाइड. एंड यू आर नॉट टॉकिंग अबाउट दैट कि आप आईसीटी और टेक्नोलॉजी दीजिए, लेकिन कैसे दीजिएगा, लास्ट बच्चे तक कैसे मिले? बिकॉज एवरी चाइल्ड हैज ए राइट टू एजुकेशन इन दिस कंट्री. एजुकेशन इज ए फंडामेंटल राइट. और लास्टली, this policy is pushing commercialization and privatization of education, not only higher education, but now in the school education also. There are so many measures, so many provisions made by the policy which promotes commercialization and privatization in this country. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, sir. Professor Gupta, like Amrit sir had already mentioned, India's public expenditure on education as a percentage of GDP is only 3%. The teacher-student ratio has been consistently low. Budget for teacher training, digital e-learning, etc. have seen drastic cuts. So given this, do you think NEP's stated goals in terms of school education are realistic, or is this only a wish list?
Well, insofar as the goal of NEP is concerned, the goals of NEP are achievable. What are the goals of NEP? Need to understand. The goal of NEP is because, just 2 months before the announcement of the NEP by the central government, or the draft NEP, and I hope we'll have time to, elaborate this, why I keep calling it draft NEP and why this. But yeah, one, the goal of the NEP is to promote the commercialization of education, which is very much evident from the document that the government of India signed just 2 months before the announcement of the approval of the draft NEP by the cabinet. What is this document? On 25th April 2020, the government of India signed a loan agreement with the World Bank. And this loan agreement is called STARS. And STARS is part of the third flagship program of the government of India. The first two were the DPEP, the District Primary Education Program, and then second one was the SSA, that is Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan. Okay. Now the third one is called the Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan, a program for school education. STARS is a component of that. Okay. Now with 1% contribution in the form of loan, remember, World Bank, and remember, World Bank is not a welfare institution. World Bank is a profit earning investing agency. Fine. So World Bank determined the overall design of what is going to be the design and the pattern of school education in India. And remember, it's World Bank project on pilot basis will be run in 6 states to tell the entire school education sector that, okay, this is how you should do. And if you look at that document, it rigorously asks for investment by the private entities. Okay, so the goal of the NEP, if the goal of the NEP is to promote privatization of education, it is achievable. But if the goal of the NEP is to provide equitable quality education for all, because that is what we need for national development. Remember the report of the Kothari Commission. What was the title of the report? Education and National Development. Because until and unless you ensure that everyone has access to equitable quality education, no nation in the world has become developed. No nation in the world can become developed. Right? So if the objective of the report is to provide equitable quality education to all, universalization of equitable quality education, then without taking certain concrete measures, it is not possible. And let me just quickly say, as Amrish ji has already said, it was in 1996 that the Kothari Commission said 6%. Since then, 1966.
You said that.
That's right. And since then, every policy, let me remind you, every policy has stated that we will raise it to 6%. BJP is not the first one. They are creating this wrong rhetoric in the media. Second, no government since then raised it to the level of 6%. Third, no deadline is given even in this report. When will they achieve it? Fourth, as Amrish Rai ji said, there is no roadmap. How will they achieve it? Now, if you look at the Kasturi Rangan committee report, no, I think it was the TSR Subramaniam committee report. I'm not too sure about Kasturi Rangan, which said that, okay, so we will include the private investment also in this. But that is not what the Kothari Commission had suggested. It was the state expenditure. Fifth, the government of India gives huge tax exemptions to corporate sector for promoting industrialization. Now, industrialization is a fruit of nation. And what is the root of national development is education. More than what you spend on elementary education, you give away as tax exemption to corporates. You have not made any promise to balance this in this report or anywhere else. So how will it happen? Fifth, we know that only 1% of our population accumulates 70% of our resources. Fine. And in fact, over last 5 years, this has gone up to 90%. 90% of the wealth generated in last 7-8 years is concentrated in 1% of our population. So I have proposed in another article that I wrote, why don't you impose 1% education tax on this 1% of our richest population rather than giving them tax exemption? You will have more than enough money. Then sixth, a lot of money in the name of CSR, corporate social responsibility, is being actually manipulated because each firm is opening its sister foundations to manage their CSR. Why does the state not take that money directly and invest in education? And seventh, remember, today, as Amrish ji hinted, we need much more because Kothari Commission had stipulated constant rise from that 6%, and all the developed countries do invest much more than that, 15 to 20%. And our understanding of education from 1960s to 2020 has changed drastically, about the rights of different people. So we need much more money. 6%, even if it's given, it is not going to be given, but even if it is given, it will not be sufficient. And the last thing that I want to mention in this regard is that it is not possible, even if the government allocates, say, 15%. The Maha Mantra, the two Maha Mantras, the two basic principles of this policy for the funding of education from elementary to higher education, the two Maha Mantra are the sinister, the ghosts that we have to fight back. And what are the two Maha Mantras? And I want to be very, very explicit because I hope our friend in Rajya Sabha, Manoj will get some benefit out of it. Yeah? It says that we will adopt a system of accreditation and link the funding of institution from this system of accreditation. Okay. And remember, this time the accreditation system is not going to be limited only to higher education. They have also proposed it for school education. Fine. Now, they have suggested a shift from quote unquote input-based approach to output measurement approach. What does it mean? It means that you will first see what is the performance level of a school or a college, and accordingly you will commit the grant. Now, since majority of our schools and colleges are already underfunded, barring the elite institutions, they will surely be low in the accreditation score. So their funding will go down considerably. Fine. So how will this funding be equitably distributed is the one, one major worry about this funding pattern, accreditation. And this last thing that I want to say is, when I say the two sinister ghosts of this, fine, what was the Gandhi's talisman? Whilst formulating a policy, we have to see the last man, quote unquote. Fine. What was Phule telling us? Phule told us, Jyotirao Phule, that the wealth of the nation, of the entire country, is generated by the producing class. Fine. So they should be the priority. Fine. What you see in this policy is a reverse pattern. In this pattern, the elite institution will get more funding, and the majority, 85 to 90% population who go to underfunded institution will be, left to live with poor infrastructure. So this policy is founded in fundamentally wrong premises. It is violative of the Constitution of India, which promised free education. Right? So I don't think there is anything that this policy actually offers. It is only an illusion, a disillusion that the government of India created by first releasing salient features in the media, and only when a lot of uproar was created, they released the draft. Fine. In the meantime, they elicited from different quarters favorable opinion. And then what happened? When this policy came, I do not know whom they hired, but somehow, very smartly what they did, they deployed all progressive discourse in this policy. And it is within that progressive discourse that they cleverly embedded imperative bureaucratic provisions to actually further make it further iniquitous, further commercialize it. So therefore, there is no way that this policy can actually lead to a system of funding which ensures equitable distribution, or rather which adheres to a principle of progressive discrimination. That is, the institutions which require more funding should be given more. It relies on a different principle. The institutions which are already better funded, they will receive more. So then you tell me how Atmanirbhar Bharat will be possible.
Professor Jha, Amrish had already touched upon this, but I'd like you to weigh in. The introduction of vocational courses has elicited a mixed response. It has been criticized for its potential to push children as young as 11 years old in violation of labor laws. And it's so apprehended that the introduction of courses like coding on one hand and skills like carpentry and plumbing on the other hand will reimpose caste divisions. What are your views on this?
I'll tell you, yes. I had vaguely referred to Kamraj versus Chakravarti Rajgopalachari. You know, Chakravarti Rajgopalachari advocated that the people coming from a particular background, they could be provided certain skill sets and they move out of their stream and go for vocation. It has all the potential to make sure that certain caste groups never see the blue sky. And others would see. So that's a very worrisome aspect. And I think everybody should realize this, that this exit at that level, it's different from an exit which is offered at a graduation level. Now, second point which Amrish ji has also touched, if you look at the diversity of school system in India, you have one room school, one teacher school, one teacher teaching 5 classes. You have different models. I mean, we look at these images only through big cities or cities per se. If you go to a tribal area or areas, say in remote Bihar or eastern UP, you would find there are schools where you just have one teacher. He or she also doesn't come regularly. So in that kind of situation, the idea of universalization and this approach, I think doesn't convince me, and it doesn't convince anybody for that matter. You know, you said, I think in the beginning, watershed. I in a lighter note, I'll say that it sheds more water on what has been done so far than being a watershed. My worry as a university teacher, and both of us, me and Vikas ji, we teach in the same university. This foreign universities coming in higher education. You know, the idea somewhere in this, all the pages of this historic so-called document, Aitihasik Dastaveज, they give you a direction that we are going to have more of hierarchy rather than doing away with hierarchy. I think both my colleagues have spoken about so many things. Teacher training is also a very, very gray area. where this document, I think it does not suggest the doables or what has to be done, what has to be the parameters. I believe in the end, if it has to be a national education policy, it should actually be taken in the spirit of what Prime Minister Sir keeps talking about, cooperative federalism. Of late, he had also spoken about many times about Atmanirbhar, which Vikas ji referred to. Problem is when you have you devise a hyphen between Atma and Nirbhar, you get these kind of documents. That's all I had to say. I have my two esteemed colleagues, Vikas ji and Ambrish ji. Thank you very much for inviting me once again.
Thank you, sir.
Can I just add something to what Professor Jha, my friend Manoj added, is that, it does talk of cooperative federalism, but, one, at the end of this, the policy says, strengthening CABE. But this policy draft has not been approved by the CABE. And still, the Minister for HRD has said that we will start implementing it. Leave apart the parliament. It hasn't gone to the parliament, but it hasn't been even approved by the CABE. Right? So how will you strengthen CABE if you have not even sought the approval of the CABE in its formulation? And two, it's not simply about one commission that you talked about, Adrina, that National Commission for Higher Education. You see, this centralization is evident at every level. I can give you more than half a dozen agencies that this draft policy intends to institutionalize. It includes National Testing Agency. It includes that Higher Education Commission. It includes the proposal to frame curriculum framework from pre-primary education for the first time to higher education for the first time. Okay, it includes the proposal for setting up the independent board for the assessment of schools in every state. It proposes to create another institution which is called Parakh. If NTA is for higher education, then Parakh is for school education. Similarly, it proposes to establish what is it called? National Research Foundation. Fine. So I can give you many other examples. If everything has been already decided in the policy to be centralized in a country which has not only a federal polity but a very diverse socio-linguistic and epistemological mosaic, if everything is to be centralized, then what is left for CABE or the state governments to do? I think that is what now you need to ask the chief ministers of every state and the education ministers of every state. What will you do? Should we not abolish the state ministries of education everywhere? If everything is going to be decided, in Delhi, what is going to be your role?
Unfortunately, we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll try and squeeze in two quick questions. Amritsar, the draft NEP concedes the rampant commercialization of both school and higher education, talks about curbing it also. But it also encourages public-spirited philanthropic institutions. So do you think, does the policy mention a clear roadmap for curbing commercialization, or does it just contradict itself?
No, you see, the earlier draft which was submitted by Kasturi Rangan committee, that draft had mentioned some provisions to stop commercialization. They have deleted that. Like the Kasturi Rangan draft has said that there are 92% teacher training institutes are run by private sector, and they have become a commercial market, profit-oriented market. So till 2030, these commercial shops should be closed down. That was the clear-cut proposal mentioned by the Kasturi Rangan committee in the original draft. They have deleted that. And now they are saying that light but tight regulatory approach we have to adopt. What is this light but tight regulatory approach? We don't know what light and tight. Second thing, this philanthropic private. You know, we have nowadays the people are coming, the big market, big corporates, industries, multinational companies are coming in to the education field, you know, and they are making pro-profit non-state actors are coming. But there is no any regulatory mechanism proposed in this national education policy, you know. And you see, who are the philanthropic? Who are the philanthropic? It is not explained into the policy, because we know nowadays no any philanthropy is coming into the education. Everybody is coming to make profit, make funding, and for the tax exemption, you know, because this is the education charitable society, they have exempted by the taxes, you know. So this is, and you see they propose PPP model, and what they are saying in the school complexes chapter, that one public school and one private school, they will build a synergy between two. It means you are legitimizing the increasing number of private schools making profit through the education. So you are legitimizing that. So you are not focusing to strengthen a public education system, not allocating adequate resources to strengthen the, or you have not given anything to implement the Right to Education Act, which is intended to universalize elementary cycle. You know, you are not talking about that. You are considering that how private sectors. I very much surprised that why neoliberal thinkers are not saying that this is the transformative document, you know, and they are not saying how they are weakening the public education system through the suggestions meant by this new education policy, and simultaneously at another hand they are encouraging private sector in the name of philanthropy, private philanthropy sector. What we need in school education and in higher education also, if you are going to stop funding to the university, we can't assume that people from the backward region, they will come again in Delhi, like JNU University, which is topmost university, other university. They can't afford to live in this city, you know. So this is not for this policy is not for the poor, not for the marginalized section, not for the children who are at the margin, you know. So this is making education a commodity. Why internationally recognize this? Education is a public good, human right. In our country, it is a fundamental right. So this is the duty of a state to provide resources and provide equitable quality education to all children. This policy is negating this purpose, this objective. So that's why I think it will not help. It will not help to universalization of education for the children. Yeah.
I'll just take 1 minute. Do you allow me? Just 1 minute.
Yes, sir.
I'll tell you, very interesting. All my co-panelists, they have been talking about, fondly remembering, in many ways, Kothari Commission. We shouldn't forget that Kothari Commission came in 1966. It was largely a Nehruvian era. Now, 54 years later, it's neoliberalism bursts out. Although I repeat, in Financial Times, there was a recent article which Financial Times is considered to be the flag bearer of neoliberal economics and politics. It asked people, important nations in the world, to revise their position on neoliberal parameters and go back to what we earlier used to have: investment in public good, public education, public health. Finally, I'll tell you one crucial area which is very important for in case of higher education, that the research areas shall no more be governed by an inquisitive mind, but by providing low-hanging fruits from the market. That should worry everyone. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I want to mention one thing which is written in the policy, that this is substantial investment in a strong, vibrant public education system, as well as the encouragement on facilitation of true philanthropic private and community participation. What is this? It means you are not allowing privatization out of the system. You are inviting privatization inside the system.
Inside the system.
So you are going to outsource so many things, so many education, which is working by the SCRT, NCRT, other educational institutions, all where you are allowing pro-profit commercial people in the name of philanthropic private sector. So, and lastly, I want to say that the Kothari Commission has suggested common school system on the concept of neighborhood. Considering school as a place for, as a space for inclusive space, place for socialization, and that 68 policy reiterated, 86 policy is reiterated, but this policy is not, they have thrown out the idea of common school system and neighborhood school, and they are not mentioned even name of the common school system. You know, the common school system is the dream of this country, you know, the poor people, because it is a tool for the transformation. It is an idea to bring equity in education and provide equitable quality education for all people. They have deleted, they have not mentioned the word common school system in this policy. First time.
Right.
Thank you.
This is not the only silence. I mean, like, this policy has a number of very glaring silences. It does not mention the term secularism. It does not talk of Urdu. It does not talk of Muslims. Even when it refers to minorities, it does not specify that it includes religious minorities. In fact, the fact that the RSS has welcomed this policy in itself, I think, is more than enough evidence to show how this policy, in the name of allowing local volunteers and, you know, outside persons, is going to fill the public bodies, you know, with its own ideological cadre. It's a policy that for the first time has also avoided reference to any terms like socialism, reservation, progressive discrimination. So it's actually, Manojji, I think because you had a lighter note, so let me make a different kind of a note. It is truly a watershed. They are right. Because of its anti-constitutionality, it is truly a watershed. It is not going to build, if it is enacted, it is not going to carry on, you know, the idea of an inclusive, secular, rational society. If enacted, it will become an instrument of indoctrination. And remember, any centralized system, we have seen this in Meiji's Japan, we have seen in Hitler's Germany, we have seen in Mussolini's Italy, we have seen in many other countries how extreme centralization of education has helped in, you know, indoctrination in particular ideologies. And this time it is unmistakably the ideology of an institution, of an organization which have never accepted Indian constitution. This is something that is very much in the public domain. We know that this, the backbone of the today's central government does not believe in Indian constitution.
So I'm sorry, I'll have to just interrupt you here and get in one last question. Professor Jha, typically any policy draft is placed on the floor of the House with a statutory time limit within which members of parliament can move amendments. But an important issue like the NEP was announced in the media in violation of this parliamentary practice. Do you think the NDA government bypassing the parliament throughout the lockdown has affected the democratic process in the country?
एक शेर है, कहाँ तक सुनोगे कहाँ तक सुनाऊं, हजारों हैं शिकवे क्या क्या गिनाऊं। तो दिक्कत यह है कि आई हैड रिटन अ पीस दैट इन पार्लियामेंट a majority is needed to form a government. But if political parties believe that majority in parliament is a license for a majoritarian parliament or a majoritarian outlook, then you come across these kind of anomalies, which are no more aberration now. This is not for the first time happen. I cannot guarantee you that this is the last time it is happening. My only worry is that till the time we don't lose complete sanctity of this forum called Parliament, which is actually the will of the people, I think any policy initiative, and during the pandemic, we have seen it, because pandemic has given the governments a kind of situation where they, under the name of Corona consensus, what they do, they take executive decisions, and executive decisions ultimately they destroy the very fabric of democracy, the fabric of conversation, engagement. I hope it is brought to the parliament. It is again should be stakeholders should be involved, as many both the colleagues here, co-panelists said, and there should be no hurry as such. Unless the idea is to what Vikas ji said, maybe is Japan. You are emulating that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. After listening to our panelists, it is safe to conclude that while the draft NEP presents an elaborate wish list, it definitely does not provide for a roadmap or infrastructure facilities to attain the same. In fact, it covertly tries to dilute the existing laws that promote education as a fundamental right while perpetuating class and caste divides. So in the light of this, it becomes especially pertinent that the policy is subjected to scrutiny by the parliament so that it does not become law in its present form. Thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.